Okay, let's talk about the Training Within Industry program and its impact on the second industrial revolution. So the Training Within Industry program was an emergency program started by the United States government after France failed to Germany in June of 1940. So the United States had not gotten involved in World War II yet, but it was obvious that that was probably inevitable, and they were already providing support to the Allied nations. And so here's an interesting time in life. As we were in the second industrial revolution, and this was 1940, so we're getting close to the end of it, but the supply chain was very domesticated. In other words, if I'm running a factory that builds stuff, say supplies for war, my suppliers are within pretty much the United States. We're not a global supply chain yet. And so during wartime, the demand for supplies goes up. But what was happening, the factories that were making those supplies here in the United States were witnessing the people who worked at those factories being drafted or enlisting and going off to war. So we're in this weird, unique period of time where we need more than we've ever gotten out before. Oh, and we need to do it with people who've never done the job before. And so that was an emergency. And so the United States government brought in a lot of industry consultants who developed a bunch of alternatives for different programs. And basically, they enlisted through volunteers or through employment of various professionals and managers from different industries and best practices to teach other industries and develop people so we could get more out than we ever had before with people who've never done it before. And so they identified a few things that were going on. So we needed to get more out. They needed to solve problems, and we didn't have a deep level of problem solvers historically in our organizations. And so we needed the pace of production to go up, and we didn't have a lot of people at various levels of organizations to solve problems, even at the pace that they were going now. And so we needed supervisors to that, and so they realized that some of the problems in not being able to solve problems was that supervisors in general didn't have the ability to train other people or promote teamwork. In other words, at this time in history, and we saw this through the evolution of management after the first industrial revolution, was that the people who became supervisors, usually those first line managers, were the ones who were the best at the actual job. And so then they kind of just become the person who kind of still did the job but told other people to do it. And maybe they ended up being a resource supplier or whatever, but they did not learn how to manage. And part of managing was training and promoting teamwork. And this was identified as an issue by the Training Within Industry professionals. So they developed a 5 needs model for supervisors. So they identified the role as the first line supervisor as the critical role to be able to make the leap that industry needed to make during this time. And so they identified a 5 needs model. 2 of them involved knowledge of the work to do the job. That's the technical aspects. If I'm welding, I need to know how to weld, and the responsibilities of the job. My responsibilities are to load the materials on, to run the welder, to produce to a schedule. What am I responsible for to do that job? And what they found is supervisors generally had those, but where they lacked were leadership skills, and specifically in improving processes, instructing and training new people, and how to lead in general, all within a safe work environment. So that was the 5 needs model that was developed by the Training Within Industry professionals based on the set of knowledges that they found that supervisors generally had, but skills and leadership that they didn't have. And so they developed what were called the J programs. And there were programs to address each of those 3 skills: job, methods, training. that was to develop the skills for improving processes. Job instruction training, which was a program to develop skills on how to train new people on how to do jobs, and job relations training, which is training for supervisors and leaders to manage the people side of things. And each of these J programs followed a generic 4-step blueprint and they used simple terms, and they used on the job. They trained small groups, 10 at a time. They trained on the job, and they also would go out and just do. So they'd do 5 2-hour meetings a week, and then they would send them out to their jobs, both to do the jobs they regularly do and to practice what they had learned. So they were training small groups and small chunks, and then going and practicing it as they learned it. And the 4 generic steps were preparation. In other words, making sure that the learner has thought and understands the concepts. Presentation, which means the trainer introduces the new ideas. Application, let them go try it. And then based on what they learn, let's go test the ability that they learned, and then decide where we need to repeat. Go and prepare again, present to fill in what we learned they haven't learned, let them go try it, and let's reassess. And so that would become, interestingly enough, the backbone for something we'll learn in the 3rd Industrial Revolution called the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. But all of those makings were part of training with an industry's 4-step blueprint method. And so for job and methods improvement, the 4 steps to train supervisors to improve job tasks were to break down the job. In other words, study, understand what the job is, what are the individual elements, what are variations and way people do things differently, time it, and understand it using parts of the scientific management that Frederick Taylor and the Gilbreths come out with. So teaching supervisors how to break a job down, how to question every detail. In other words, don't just train people on how things are done now. Question, why are things done? How are they done? Who has to do it? In what order does it need to be done? And so they were trained on how to question every detail. And that would give them ideas to either eliminate steps, combine steps, rearrange steps, simplify how things are done. And then once they have questioned every detail, that would help them develop a new method and identifying what the new steps are, key points and reasons why those steps are important, and come up with different ways to visually illustrate it. And so then they would go and implement the new method and see how they learned. And that would use the 4-step job instruction training method for implementation once they polish out the new improved job. Interestingly enough, this 4-step job method training would become the basis for what the Japanese companies after World War II would call Kaizen, and we'll learn more about that as well in the 3rd Industrial Revolution. So then the 2nd J program, once we've improved how to do a job, is how do we train new people on how to do a job. Edwards Deming, someone else we'll learn about in the 3rd Industrial Revolution. He was a management and quality consultant, said if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And so what they found out is a lot of supervisors at this time were really good at what they did, but not good at describing and training other people on it. So again, they adopted the generic 4-step blueprint to very specific 4 steps for job instruction training. Step 1, prepare the trainee. So if I'm training you, I find out, what do you know about the job right now? I let you know and put you at ease. Hey, we're going to do this. This is why we're doing it. Here's the expected results of the process. Then I would present how to do the job. And I would do that in 3 waves. I would present the job and how to do it once, just talking about the main steps. I do step A, then step B, then step C to produce this final product. Then I present it again, adding key points for each main step. Step 1, I do A. key point. When I do A, make sure that you use your left hand to hold this steady when you insert with your right hand. And then I demonstrate it a third time as the trainer. I present the job a third time, adding reasons why each key point's important. So main step, I perform A. Key point to A. Hold steady with your left hand while you insert with your right hand. Reasons why? Because if you don't hold steady with your left hand, the connection will wobble, and it will take extra time to align and complete the step. So the idea is, if you introduce things, because a lot of times when people train people, they try to dump all the information at one time. Well, you grab this with your left hand, your right hand, and you do, and people can't learn with one big wave of information, so you give them to them in increments. And this was teaching supervisors how to do that. Just tell them the main steps first, then demonstrate it again, present it, adding in key points for each step, and then demonstrate it a third time, explaining reasons why each key point is important. And then the step 3 is I have the trainee demonstrate back to me that same process, but I have them demonstrate it back to me in the same 3 phases. Okay, show me how to do this step and explain what it is. Okay, show me how to do this step again, and as you're doing it, articulate back to me the key points. And when you show me a third time, I want you to do the main step, explain the key point, and tell me the reason why that's important. And as the person being trained goes through that, it gives me, the trainer, an opportunity. If they forget a key point, or they struggle with a key point, or they can't explain why a key point's a key point, it gives me a coaching opportunity as they're trying it out to reinforce that point. And so then after I've prepared the trainee in step 1, I myself have presented the job in 3 waves, just explaining the key steps, then adding key points, then explaining reasons why. Then I have the person being trained try it out and demonstrate it back to me in those same 3 phases. Then we'll get together and I will provide feedback. They'll provide feedback. Hey, I noticed when you did this step that you forgot this key point. And they'll provide feedback. I'm still kind of uncertain on when I do this or why I do this. What's the reason? Then we can decide together what level of proficiency that person is, and they came up with a 4-level proficiency. So it would be a quadrant where level 1 is, basic steps. Level 2 is, you can perform all the steps of a job but under supervision. Level 3 is you can perform all the steps of the job without supervision. And so then as a trainer, I can back off. And level 4 is you can perform all the tasks to do a job and train someone. And so they had very specific levels of proficiency that they could develop people to. This is just an example of a job instruction sheet that they would use to develop how to do specific tasks. So then there was even an area where they could sketch the task. I have learned to use this when I was teaching kids jiu-jitsu, and I found that they learn this very well. So in other words, if I was teaching a technique we call the matalea, the lion killer choke or the rear naked choke, I would say there's 4 main steps. Wrap the choking arm around, position the non-choking arm, position your body. Step 4, finish the choke. And then for each main step, then demonstrate it with any key points. Step 1, position the choking arm. Key point to that, make sure the bend of your elbow lines up with their chin. And there may be other key points to each step. And then when I demonstrate it a third time, I add the reasons why. Step 1, position the choking arm. Key point, make sure the bend of your elbow lines up with their chin. The reason why, because the choke is to stop the blood flow on both sides of the neck to the brain. If the elbow is too too far to one side, it'll not effectively block both sides, and you can't finish the choke quickly enough. And so then when they demonstrate the same move, the first time they just have to say, here are the 4 steps to do that choke. And then they would have to say, all right, they'd have to do each step and then tell me the key points. Then they would have to explain the reasons why. And each time they forget, it allows me an opportunity to insert and coach. So there are 3 things that would make something, as the supervisor creates these sheets, a key point. 1 is if it's a quality concern. Hey, if you don't do this, it'll be a defective product. 2, it's a safety concern. Here's a key point, because if you don't do this, you'll damage your hand. Or 3, here's a knack that makes it better. Here's a key point. I've learned that if you make a loop with your left hand before you tie the knot, it makes this step easier. So if those 3 things were guidance that were given to supervisors, and so they would create job instruction sheets to be able to train people faster. And then the third J program was job relations training. And so the 4-step process to job relations training. And this is when there's a disagreement or a conflict between employees or a grievance. Me as a supervisor, what is the process I should follow to resolve this? Remember, this is in 1940. People didn't have a lot of job training on how to manage human relations issues on jobs. And that was one of the gaps identified by training within industry. And so they gave supervisors 4 steps. Step 1, get the facts, understand the whole story from both sides. Sort out opinions and feelings from facts. Step 2, weigh and decide. Don't jump to conclusions before you get the facts. Understand what happens, stop, think about it, think about the alternatives and the ramifications. Step 3, take action. Don't pass the buck. Don't hope that it works itself out. Don't take action later on. Act in a timely manner. And step 4, once you've taken action, go back, follow up, and make sure that you've resolved the situation. And if you haven't, let's go back to the beginning and start all over again. So they came up with the 3 4-step processes to develop the skills that supervisors didn't generally have. And so as a result, here are some impacts of the training within industry program. Between 1940 and the end of the war in 1945, over 1.5 million workers were trained and over 16,000 factories. They surveyed 600 companies at the end of the war. 86% of those companies who used training within industry methods saw an increase in production by at least 25%. All of the companies saw a reduction in training time. 88% of the companies saw a reduction in labor hours. Over half saw a reduction in scrap, so better quality was happening. And all the companies saw reduction in grievances. So there were less conflict, better quality, more productivity in labor hours and time, and increased production. So big success. Here's a couple of case stories. Boeing, in 1940, they needed to make more B-17 bombers. And so they went from making 75 a month in 1941 to, at one point before the end of the war, they were able to make 364 in a month and reduced 60% reduction in man hours per plane and halved the cost reduction of 42% over in less than 3 years. So great productivity improvements. Oh, and by using a workforce of cowboys, farmers, fishermen, lumberjacks, and housewives, people who weren't going off to war and who have not normally done the job. So big success. Here's another example. The Battle of Midway, which was one of the turning points in World War II in the Pacific theater between the U.S. and Japan. After the war, Japanese shipbuilders added 6 additional carriers to the 2 that survived. And in the same period of time, U.S. shipbuilders added all of this through increased productivity in factories. Those numbers had an advantage and made a huge difference. So TWI was successful. And guess what? We went from the Rosie the Riveter campaign of, hey, we can do it, to we did it, and the war was over. The Allied nations prevailed. Everyone returned home, and guess what? It kind of died. Things went back to the way they were. People got content. But what was really interesting is it found new life in Japan, because as we will find in the third industrial revolution after World War II, their economy was in shambles. The U.S. sent a lot of consultants and management and even military presence to help them reestablish industry. Toyota, who we'll talk about a lot and has shaped my background in management philosophy tremendously, was one of the companies that was helped and embraced the training within industry methods from the very beginning, still use them to this day. Sanyo was another Japanese company who embraced it, developed some train-the-trainer programs. In the early 80s, as they expanded overseas, one of those people who worked for Sanyo, named Patrick Gropp, back in those days, as one of their first foreign employees who had been trained in TWI methods, returned to the U.S. and started the training within an industry program in 2000, so 60 years later, and companies started learning the techniques all over again and are also part of the program of what's called lean manufacturing based on the Toyota production system now, because Toyota still employs these techniques to this day. So that's the training within industry program and the contribution that it made to productivity increases during the second industrial revolution.